Okay. Bonjour à tous. My name is Andrea Pierini, and first of all, I want to apologize for my bad English. I'm much more comfortable with French, so I hope that you will understand what I'm talking. I will talk very slow, and I know only a few words of English, but these are technical words, so I guess everyone is able to understand me. First, a little bit about me. Very short introduction. Yes, that's me. Among the other things, I am an IT architect and security manager. I have a very long time experience. I think I'm one of the oldest here. And IT security has always been a very special interest for me. To be honest, offensive security is much more a hobby for me. And during my spare time, I like to understand better the vulnerabilities of Windows and Linux systems. These are my contacts. And to demonstrate that I'm old, I don't know how many of you attended this chat system. This was a French chat system on X25 networks. So it was on the pre-internet area. And this was a very, very funny place where you could meet hackers worldwide. And I learned very, very many things in this period. Okay, so back to us. Why this talk? Because I forgot to say you that I'm talking about Windows privileges. I guess that everyone here knows what Windows privileges are, okay? And why did I choose this talk? Because during the time, I noticed that often these privileges are misunderstood or they are not taken in consideration when you have to do privilege escalation. So I decided to learn them better and to make some practice with the privileges in order to understand how to make privilege escalation by abusing from these privileges. Sorry, I am Italian, so I speak also with my hand. Don't pay too much attention to my hands, okay? One day I ran in this great article, which was a perfect summary of what you can do with some privileges, especially the God privileges, the maximum privileges that the user can have. And I got in contact with the authors, and we exchanged also very useful information. So this is the agenda, short introduction about privileges and how to get them. And then we will dig deeper in some very interesting privileges, like the debug privilege, the restore, backup, take ownership, and so on. And finally, special attention to the last two ones, because in conjunction with an exploit, has been demonstrated to be very powerful privileges because Microsoft was not able to fix them, okay? And then finally, prevention and some final thought. Is my English okay? Great. I don't want to bore you with Windows privileges, so it will be a very, very short introduction. What is a Windows privilege? Is a special right that you can grant to a user or a group in order to perform special operations on the operating system, like shutting down the system, changing the system time, doing a backup, and so on. Some built-in users or groups have already built-in privileges, and you can assign privileges via the, the GUI interface, but you can also play with them by invoking the right APIs too. So you don't need a graphic interface to assign them. Another interesting thing is that some privileges bypass totally the security settings. So, for example, backup and restore privileges, but also debug privileges, don't take in consideration the security which has been put on this object. Another interesting thing that you have to pay attention is that some privileges are only available in a high integrity level process, typically an elevated shell, because if you have a standard shell, you won't see the privileges. You have to elevate to a high integrity process. And okay, whoami/priv will list your privileges. Another concept is the Windows Access Token, because it's bind with the privileges. What is a Windows Access Token? Again, I don't want to bore you. It's an object which is created when you log on, and this object is used when you need to access a securable object in order to verify if your rights are appropriate to access the object, or when you want to perform use a privileges, because in the access token, all these informations are stored. So you can see among the other things, a Windows Access Token contains the list of the privileges, the type of the token, and the type of impersonation level. What does this mean? Very, very quickly. A token can be primary or impersonation. If it is a primary token, you can launch processes with it. If it is an impersonation token, you can impersonate the trade. Very simple. The impersonation levels, there are 4 impersonation levels, but the only useful for us for privilege escalation are the last 2 ones. Another thing, that when your token is created, you cannot add new privileges, obviously, no? But you can enable or disable privileges. You can also duplicate tokens. So from a primary token, you can duplicate it and get an impersonation token, and vice versa. Which are the accounts that have special privileges? I said it before. Obviously, administrators, local system, who has maybe not all privileges, but most of them. Then some built-in groups, backup operator, printer operators, server operators, okay? Local service and virtual accounts, managed service account, usually they have very, very interesting privileges. Usually they have impersonation and assigned primary token privileges. We will see this more later. Then third-party application users, and sometimes it can happen misconfigured users, because a lazy admin playing with the GPA edit console clicked on the wrong button and assigned a privilege to a user who doesn't need to have this privilege. For example, this is the backup exec utility, and in the specification of this utility, 3 privileges are required. Backup and restore, obviously, because it is a backup utility, and also the TCP privilege, act as part of operating system. This means that we have granted to this user the right to access everywhere, to have full control on our machine. Okay, how can we hunt these privileged accounts? So the techniques, I think you know better than me, because I'm not a pen tester, all these techniques. But basically, weak service configuration, remote code execution, everything that gives me the possibility to gain access like a user who has special privileges. So stealing credentials, man in the middle via NTLM, and so on, Kerber hosting, etc., etc. There is also another possibility to get privileges and manipulate tokens by using exploits. Oh, mamma mia, okay. The most interesting one are the last 2, partial rights and arbitrary rights. This has successfully been demonstrated that with partial rights, I can activate, or arbitrary rights, I can activate additional privileges on my token. So if I am a simple user, but I can exploit a binary who has some weakness, I can, from the user land, interact with the kernel in the process structure and activate some privileges. So this is another very, very interesting. So my talk is not about how to get them and so on. My talk, the goal of my talk, and I hope I will meet this goal, is to show you with some practical examples, once you have one God privilege, how you can abuse from this privilege, okay? And so let's start with the first one. I think the debug privilege, all of you know the debug privilege. This is the simplest and the most powerful privilege. Because and it's not me that I'm saying this, but a guy from Microsoft more than 10 years ago said, if you grant somebody the debug privilege, you gave it away the farm. Because, why is this possible? Because the debug privilege was given to be able to debug a process, but not only my process, the process of every user or system administrator, does not import. So once I can debug a process, obviously I can inject code in this process, inject malicious code in this project, execute the code in order to get a shell or whatever else. So these are the well-known APIs for interacting with remote threads, writing to the memory, and so on. One other interesting way to abuse from this privilege is to set the parent process a privileged process, because starting from Windows Vista, it is possible to modify the parent process of a process and to set the process to another user. So if with the debug privilege, I can spawn my process and tell to my process that the parent process is a process, for example, belong to system. And with this simple PowerShell script, I published it on GitHub, but you can do it in many other ways. As you can see, it's getting a system with debug privilege is as easy as drinking a bottle of water. It's very, very easy. So it's a very powerful privilege which needs special, very special attention. Don't grant debug privilege, okay? The restore privilege. Okay, what means this privilege? This privilege grants you to perform restore of files, but not only files, also registry keys. What does this mean? That with this restore privilege, I can access files which normally I could not access. And this is, you can imagine, very, very powerful. 2 APIs and millions of possibility. Create file and reg create key. The important thing is to have the restore privilege, enable the restore privilege, and to use this simple flag in my API. So I'm telling to the operating system that I'm performing a restore, and he permits me to do everything I want, okay? I can even overwrite in the system32 directory, where you know all files are owned by trusted installer, so it's very difficult to overwrite them. All checks are bypassed, so I can overwrite this file. So how can I do privilege escalation with this privilege? I think there are millions of possibilities. I will show you one very simple example. I will modify the configuration of a service which runs under the system account and is startable by all users, and then get back a reverse shell. The service in question is the whoami push service. I hope that my spelling is correct, because I never know how to spell in English some words. As you can see, this service in red is startable by all users. This is very good. So we have a service that runs like a system, is startable by each user. We have restore privileges. So obviously, what are we going to do? We create our service DLL, which doesn't do what Windows expects, but will simply launch a batch file which contains my reverse shell. Once my DLL is compiled, I simply put this DLL in the system32 directory, and I will change the parameters of the service configured in the registry. I will override the service DLL parameter, not more pointing to the original DLL, but to my DLL. And once I'm done, I will copy it in system32, but I could also launch it from another location. just to show you that it's possible. Or if I'm very bad guy, I could overwrite the original DLL because I can do it even if it is protected by trusted installer. I have also a short video about this, and this is it. It's very simple. I'm not a good video maker. I have an elevated shell, so I have the restore privilege. All I do is putting this piece of code in my exe and do it. I have overwritten the service DLL, and now I start the service because I can do it. Okay, and now let's verify. I get the back connection, and I'm system. Very easy. Do you agree? Backup privilege, this is the opposite one, okay? Again, with this privilege, I can backup files, so I can access file, which normally I could not access because I'm performing a backup operation. Again, I will use the same APIs because backup software use these APIs, and I can do many of nasty things with it. For example, I can back up the SAM database of the local registry because with the reg utility, if I have the backup operators, it permits me to save the system hive and the SAM hive. And then with one of the tools, in this example, I'm using Mimikatz, but you can use other tools, I can dump the hashes of the NTLM database, and so get the hashes of a local administrator and so on. I can also access files which I could not access. Again, with the create file API, just specifying the flag backup semantics. And I'm able, in this case, to read the file of a local administrator. Members of backup operators on the domain controller can backup also the ntds.dit file, so the entire active database directory. And they can do it because this file, as you know, you cannot access this file because it is blocked because it is in use. But using backup software, you can back up the database. In this case, I'm using VBadmin as a normal user only with backup privilege. I save I make a backup copy of the ntds.dit file, and then with one of the various tools, I get the boot key, and then I dump all the hashes, in this case, the hashes of the domain admin of this database. So with the backup operators, I can get domain admin without problem. I can also use another utility. I don't know how many of you know of this utility. It's the disk shadow utility, which is very useful because unlike WSS admin, you don't need to be admin to launch them, but you can backup also with this utility the ntds.dit database. In this case, I make a backup, then I copy the database because I cannot access the database, but I copy always with create file and backup option on another directory, and then again, I get the boot key and I can dump all the users. Okay. There is also which I call a special bonus, because if you have backup, if you are a member of backup operators, you automatically have two privileges, backup and restore privileges. And with these two privileges combined, you can also change the access control list of each file and registry or directory. And this is also very, very powerful. In this example, I changed via PowerShell script. This file is owned and only an administrator has full control on it. I can change the access list and grant to myself the right to access to the file. The take ownership privilege is another God privilege. Why? Because, as Microsoft says, This privilege allows you to take ownership of a generic securitable object in the system. Two APIs, set security info or set name security info. In the first one, I have to pass the handle. In the second one, directly the name of the resource of the object I want to take ownership. There exist many types of, many object types, file, printer, shares, registry keys, and so on. And once I gain the ownership of the file, clearly what I can change the permission, and then the same rules apply, like, for example, the restore privilege. So in this example, I will show you, I will change the parameters of the MSI server service, which is a service which normal users can always start. So first of all, I will take the ownership of the registry key. When I took the ownership of the registry key referring to this service, I will create an access list which permits, for keeping it simple, to everyone to access completely this registry key in read and write. And once I have set the permission, I alter the service, and I say, and I will launch, instead of the original exe, for example, a command which will add myself to local domain, local administrator groups. This other privilege is very, very powerful too, because it's a God privilege too. What does this privilege say? Microsoft says this privilege is act like as an operating system. What does this mean? That with privilege I can impersonate, I can obtain a token for every user without specifying credentials. And the other cool thing is that I can add supplementary accesses to my token. For example, I can add to my token other groups. So if I have a normal user, I can add to my token the membership to a local administrator. This is very, very powerful. But we have a problem, because I can get this powerful token, but I'm not able to impersonate it, because in order to impersonate the token, I need a special privilege, which is impersonation privilege. I have only this one privilege, so how can I do it? We know that it is possible to impersonate a thread as long as the token is mine and the integrity level of the token is less or equal to the process to the originating process. And Microsoft added other constraints starting from Windows 10. But there is a good news. We can impersonate the thread in these conditions. We can impersonate the thread without any privileges and ignoring completely all these constraints. And why is this possible? Because of this. As long as the resulting token origin ID equals the authentication ID of the originating process, and this is always the case, all other checks are bypassed, because the kernel, the first thing it checks is, okay, what is the token origin ID and what is the authentication ID? Are they the same? Okay, go. You can impersonate the thread and you don't have any limitations. That's cool, no? I have some examples, prepared some examples to show you how to abuse from these privileges. In the first two, I will the MSV1 S4U logon extension. This is the extension that we need to call in order to impersonate the user, calling the LSA logon user function. And in the other case, I will use the Kerberos extension, so I can impersonate the domain admin. In the first example, I will impersonate myself, so I will get back a token from with my user, but I will add as an extra group the administrator group to my token. And once I have this token, I will impersonate a thread with this token and grant to myself the debug privilege, because I love the debug privilege. Or I can ignore completely what Microsoft says, because the two origin and authentication ID are the same. I will impersonate administrator, and I will add myself to the local domain, local administrator group. The last example, using Kerberos domain authentication, I will impersonate a domain admin as a domain user with TCP privilege. I will impersonate the domain admin and try it in the system32 directory. As you can see, the last one is very, very easy if you do it in C#. 2 lines of code, very, very easy to abuse from. So I don't think I need other explanation. This is the other example where I use the MSV1 extension and ATLM authentication, okay? So I can impersonate TCP user or administrator. I can add an extra seed. Typically, this is the seed of the local administrator group. Call my function, my API call LSA logon user, okay? And passing the groups, and I will get back this wonderful token, which I called HToken S4U, which I can then impersonate in a thread and do all my nasty things. For example, in the first one, I will add a privilege, add the debug privilege to my token, and in the second one, to my user, and in the second one, I will grant myself, I will put myself in the local administrator group. Because I have a video about this. I have 2 videos. You trust in what I'm saying, yes? Okay, I will show you another video. This is more a joke I made with my sysadmin colleagues, because I told them, we make a bet. As a local administrator, I will impersonate a guest account and act like a domain admin. They told me, no, you are crazy, it's not possible. Okay, if I'm able to do it, you will pay me a bottle of Italian red wine, okay? And this is what I did. Local admin, guest user account enabled, I launch my silly program, the app please, okay? So I am user guest. Let's show my groups. And as you can see, I'm member of domain admins. Is it true? Okay, so because they didn't trust me. Okay, let me show you this one. I go in the administrator directory of the domain admin. As guest user, it should be impossible to get in, no? And then only domain admin can access this file. And this was it. And evening after, I drank a fantastic red wine, Sagrantino. It comes from Umbria, where I live. Okay, thank you. This is clearly more a joke, because as you can imagine, with TCP privilege, I can alter, can put groups, everything I want. So I could do it in many other ways, but just to get them, they were really, really scared after this demo. Create token privilege is, as the word says, the privilege which is granted to create a token. So I can create a token with the specific API, NAT or ZW create token, and I can create a custom token, putting everything inside I want, privileges, groups, and so on. So also this one is a very, very powerful, it's a God privilege. I can use this token without impersonation privileges if the token is mine and so on, okay? And this is great, but we have a problem. Starting, and this is something I discovered 2 weeks ago, starting from the Windows 1809 or Windows 2019 server, this doesn't work anymore. Even if I have the create token privilege, I'm not able to impersonate it. And this is the error I get back. As you can see, I created a fantastic token because I put administrator and trusted installer in my token, so I could go everywhere in the file system. But it didn't work, because if I tried to write a file in the system32 directory, I got an access denied. And the problem was that the impersonation level is invalid. What does this mean? That probably the kernel demoted my token to an identification token, which is a real beautiful token, but I cannot impersonate it. So this was really sad for me, because I thought, but there should be a possibility. It's not possible that it doesn't work. After some tests, I discovered this one, that if I set the authentication ID and with create token, I can set the authentication ID to the anonymous logon ID. This one with 7 is the system ID, so it's the system logon ID. If I set it to anonymous authentication ID, again, like the other trick, Windows doesn't make other check, because it's an anonymous authentication, so it's not the dangerous token, because it's anonymous. Normally you can do anything with this token, but no, because in this token I put special groups. You cannot use everything, but a subset of API calls works, and especially these two one, create file and drag create key. So again, you have the key of the kingdom spec, but you can alter a service, do everything with it. So sometimes Microsoft fixes, but they don't care about what they thought it could not be broken, okay? 15 minutes, okay. This is the API call. As you can see, I can pass the authentication ID. So if I pass the anonymous authentication ID, I have create token privilege, it's okay, I can go on. The load driver privilege, what does this privilege mean? That you can load kernel drivers, okay? How can you abuse from, first of all, load driver privilege is granted to the by default to the printer operators of the domain controller. This is very cool. To abuse from this driver, obviously, I need to load the driver which has some vulnerabilities that I have to exploit. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. And you have also to trick the NT-load driver function to load the parameters of this driver, not from the classical system32 system hive, but from another hive, because I cannot write in a system hive. And this example, I will show you how you can abuse using a known vulnerability of a recent vulnerability of a driver of an anti-malware software, Stopzilla. This driver is known to be vulnerable. It's a signed driver. It gets not caught by antivirus, so you can abuse from it. I create a special registry under my local profile and then tell to NT-load driver to load the parameters of this driver from this hive, which is under my control. And with NT-load driver, I load the driver. And if everything works, I get the driver loaded, okay? And then I will use an exploit for this driver, which I modified a little bit. And this is interesting because in this exploit, you have to change two privileges, the load driver privilege and the create token, because it's an arbitrary right which activates you the create token privilege. So I obtain the token, I obtain this privilege, and then I add myself to the local administrator group. So this is an example of how abusing from this driver. Okay, finally, the last two ones. The impersonate assigned primary token. These are also very powerful privileges because they permits you to impersonate an access token. So if you are able to get an access token from a privileged user, you can impersonate them with these two privileges. Assigned primary, you can impersonate a process, or impersonate privilege, you can impersonate a process or a thread. Impersonate privilege calls the create process with token API, which permits you to launch a process, but it relies on the secondary logon service. So if the secondary logon server is not running, you cannot use this one. The assigned primary token is also interesting because it's available in a medium integrity level process. Here you can see what sort of nasty things you could do with these privileges. How can we get this privileged token? Because we have impersonation or assigned primary, we need to get the token of a privileged user. Well, there are so many ways to do it. The classic ways is via name pipe. If you force a privileged process to write a name pipe which is under your control, once the privileged process writes in your pipe, you intercept it, impersonate the thread, get the token, and then you can do everything with this one. Or via a local NTLM authentication, which is very, very interesting, or via DCOM RPC callbacks. The killer exploit for these two privileges is the rotten potato. I don't know how many of you knows about these privileges, about this exploit. You already know it? Okay. This is a fantastic exploit, and basically it's this one. If you request the initialization of the DCOM object using a fake storage object, you can reflect the RPC communication to a local endpoint which is under your control. And when NTLM local authentication occurs, you modify the NTLM message in order to establish a security context. Once you have established the security context, you are able to get the token, and with the privilege, we impersonate it. If I impersonate a local system authentication, I have the token of the system users, and I have the maximum of privileges. There has been also an exploit published 3 years ago, and it's still working. And this original exploit relied on a meta-interpreter incognito. There were other standalone variants. Me too, I wrote 2 variants which didn't rely on this one, but were standalone. But there was a problem. First of all, the DCOM server was fixed. It was the bits, the background intelligent transfer service. And the second one was that also the local listening port was fixed on 666, okay? And during a Windows desktop hardening review, my friend Giuseppe found a weak service configuration, gained access with these privileges, but the rotten potato did not work because the bit server was unavailable and the local port was firewalled. So we decided together to produce this one, the juicy potato. How many of you knows about this? Great. We discovered that other than bits, there were other out-of-process COM servers which could be abused. Important thing is that they run as local system, they can be instantiated by a service user, and then they expose the unmarshal interface because all the magic occurs during the unmarshalling of the object. We discovered also that were interesting CLS ID which impersonates the user connected to the first session. So if I have a domain administrator connected, I can, using this CLS ID, impersonate directly the domain administrator. It's cool. Okay. Here you can see the typical setup of a perfect DCOM server. What does our tool do? It's what published last year. You can choose a CLS ID. You can define a listening port, because in order to do that, we had to change the string binding of the Marshall interface pointer structure. You can define also an external RPC port and IP address. And in this, if you have a machine under your control, the authentication will be totally silent, because in the local event viewer, there will be no trace of your authentication as system, your abuse of this exploit. The program to launch with optional argument, if you want to use one or the 2 process modes you want to use, and also you produce the list of CLS ID for every Windows version. You can find it here on the GitHub, and recently it is also available as Metasploit module. 8 minutes, okay. Okay, this is an example of some of this. And I will show you a short video also about this. I have gained CMD Aspix shell, okay? My user is the highest typical default app user who has these privileges. So I will launch my juicy potato with in the CLS ID, the interesting one. Et voilà, I'm domain administrator. Very easy. 7 minutes. Oh, short. Okay. So this is because it's very, how can you say, disrupting this privilege. You know? So I asked Microsoft, hey, what can I do in order to prevent this one? The first thing is that, reading their answer, they were not aware of this kind of exploit. It seems strange to me, but it was. And after some exchange of email, they told you, well, we are working hard on it, but probably, as Microsoft says, the behavior is by design, so we cannot change this, okay? And the last email, in the current model, we can give no hardening recommendation because we cannot fix this one. Maybe in the next version. Was the last mail, and then Microsoft closed the case. So, is it possible to prevent it? Yes and no. Obviously, protect sensitive accounts. This seems obvious, no? Or end your application. Disable unnecessary service. On Windows 2016, the Xbox game service, which runs a system, was enabled. So you have to tell me what the hell do I need the Xbox service on a Windows server? It's crazy. And then restrict the permissions. It could be an option, but it could be very dangerous. Or disable DCOM at all. But here again, you could run into several problems. So the good news for the defenders is if you upgrade to Windows 18.09 or Windows 2019, the exploit does no more work because they fixed it. It's no more possible to do oxide resolving using a port different than 135. And so they finally fixed it. So, but there are several Windows 2016 servers. There are several Windows 10 desktop with a version smaller than this one. So the problem remains. Final thoughts from the attacker perspective, never underestimate, obviously, these privileges, especially in elevated shell. And in Windows pre-versions, if you have these two privileges, you are automatically system. This is what we call the golden privilege. And the service users are more safety than the security features. Maybe there are other interesting privileges to abuse from. Probably yes. There are some new privileges which no one knows exactly what they do. So it's another, there are another, you can explore other privileges. So we have 4 minutes, that's all. I hope that you enjoyed my talk, that it was, and a special thanks to this person. We have